Hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Good.
Awesome. So, we're at our latest niche conversation. I'm Jessica DeWitt. I'm one of the editors here at the Network in Canadian History and Environment. And today I am joined by Catherine Paulin. And want to tell us more about yourself?
Sure. I am a PhD candidate in history at l'Université de Montréal. My supervisor is Michel Dagenet. So I've been working on basically animal history, of course, but also urban and environmental history. So those are my specialties.
Awesome. So, over the past year, we featured your work on animal history quite a bit, three times, I think.
Yeah.
So that's why I invited you here today. So we're just going to have a general chat about that. So I thought start the talk by asking you how you define animal history and why it's important to you, and why you think it's important to environmental history and society more broadly.
Right. And that's kind of a tricky question. It's kind of personal, I feel, because what is animal history? I think we'll gain many different answers from different people, because
Mhm.
um, over the past year, I've kind of been thinking about this a lot. And I feel like there's animal history, but also kind of the history of animals and just more broadly, I'd say animal studies.
Mhm.
Then how do we define these, and which one is kind of the correct way to do animal history?
Mhm.
It gets really, really complex. I feel like for some people, animal history is more like saying different facts about animals, or like how they're represented in
Mhm.
sources and things like that. While for others, it's more about actually including them actively in history and showing that they do have a past and an impact on the past. Um, for myself, I kind of situate myself between both, I guess. I I think that, it's okay to kind of just go into sources and get these facts straight out of the sources and just kind of enumerate them. But I feel like we can also do so much more. So even if it's really tricky, that's the other thing. I feel
Mhm.
like probably for most people, what's controversial isn't so much, doing animal history, but how do we do animal history? And that's where it gets complex.
Mhm. Yeah. One of the interesting things that I think about is that some animal historians consider themselves to be environmental historians, and some of them have never considered it, right? And for me, I always loop animal historians under the umbrella of environmental history because you're working with the non-human, and to me that means that it's environmental because we're interacting with other species that are around us, and that's part of the environment, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but that's something I'm always thinking about is how um, that works. And so, yeah, do you have any thoughts on that? Like, how do you definitely consider animal history to be part of environmental history?
For myself, yes,
Mm-hmm.
I do, because I feel like that's kind of my entryway into being able to see the actual impact that animals will have on the past, in the past. Um, I I guess it's probably not the only way, but
Yeah.
for me, it's the way that works seems to work the most,
Mm-hmm.
because it's a way of actually measuring that impact, of actually seeing that impact in a more concrete way, because then you can say, okay, well, you know, some people have a lot of trouble accepting animal agency, and I understand how that can be really, really tricky to kind of grasp it and see how they can actually have, like, an impact in the past, because it's not like humans. They don't have this kind of master plan at, like, they're not going to plan out their different actions so that they have like this concrete um, influence on other beings or whatever. But at the same time, I feel that we really need to reflect on how they can impact the past, and through some of their actions, I feel like that's possible to kind of
Mm-hmm.
get to. And these actions often will have an impact on the environment before even impacting anything else. So then how humans will react to that action is how, I don't know, how I get to see the impact, once again, that they have. I can give an example. Like, for example, to recognize kind of the needs or the wants of animals. Let's say they're in a pen somewhere. You have cattle in a pen, and they want to get to the grass on the other side of the pen. Well, maybe they're going to be able to break through. And if they do break through, that's when we're going to see them in the sources. So they had an impact on the environment, which then impacted humans, and then humans will react to that and kind of additionally add to the environmental impact by either making more fences or building them taller, or so I feel like environmental history, in a way, and reflecting on how changes in the environment will occur is how we can kind of understand their role in the past more easily. Yeah. If that makes any sense.
Definitely. And I love animal history in that it decentralizes the human, right? And that's something that I think about a lot, even in my everyday life, is that decentralizing the supremacy of humans and human wants and needs, and just kind of the tension that there is in that with animal history, and acknowledging animal agency while not reading too much humanness into it and too much. It's such a interesting, and often it's a very experimental exercise, I find.
It is.
Yeah. So over the past year, we've been in the pandemic, and last year you wrote a bit about human-animal relations right at the beginning of the pandemic and how that was changing the way that you were thinking about animal history. And then you also participated in and summarized a Niche New Scholars discussion of this topic. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how animal history and animal studies has been affected by the pandemic, and what aspects of it have really come to the forefront.
Right. Well, I think for myself, I didn't really see it coming. I didn't expect there to be such a huge impact at first, because I was kind of starting to go through my sources. I was at Library Archives Canada past March. So things were just starting to kind of feel like they were going to come to Canada with the COVID pandemic, and things were starting to be a bit more tricky, let's just say. And at that time, I was going through sources from the Minister of Agriculture, and I think already then I started looking at my sources differently. So as a historian, the pandemic already changed my own perspective on my sources, and I would be going through them, and there was a lot of information about cases of bovine pleural pneumonia in the 19th century. And I honestly think that if it hadn't been for the pandemic, I would have kind of gone over that a lot quicker than I did. And taking the time to kind of go through it, I noticed that, there's a lot to kind of reflect on, because as much in the past as today, I feel like different situations with pandemics or just disease in general, humans will try to find a culprit or someone to pin it on. And for COVID, it was really animals at first, especially. So was it a bat which caused this pandemic, or was it a pangolin? And I kept thinking, well, why wouldn't it just be humans? Why does it have to be an animal which maybe it's the vector, it's the start of a pandemic, but there's a reason why it got so bad. And I feel like we kind of have to reflect more on our own practices. And that's going back to your first question, why is it important to study animals in the past, and why is animal history important? Well, because we need to I think it's becoming more and more urgent to kind of reflect as humans, on the impact we have on our environment and on other beings.
Mm-hmm.
And this pandemic has really shown us how, it may be industrial farming or like the destruction of natural habitats and all that has really had an impact on how we are able to deal with these kinds of events, and or not deal with them at all, because we're creating situations which lead to just, I don't know, it's just, I'm losing myself in my train of thought.
Yeah.
But like basically, I feel like we don't reflect enough on ourselves as humans, and the pandemic has kind of shown us how you maybe stop trying to find that culprit somewhere else and start looking at yourself, just more generally as a human being, and what you do to impact what's around you.
Yeah.
So, So I guess that's kind of a positive outcome of the pandemic in a sense, because I feel like people are actually starting to reflect more on what they can do to kind of stop these kinds of things from happening.
Mm-hmm.
They realize that it can get pretty bad.
Yeah. Particularly during the first several, probably through the summer, that's what struck me, is that people were kind of the media and the general public were grappling with some ideas and questions that, environmental and animal historians are always thinking about and always conscious of, right? We're always looking at connections and those consequences, right? And we really need more of that education in our lives, just like a understanding of how we relate to everything else in the world, whether it's people or animals or, biomes, etc., and perhaps that's a positive aspect coming out of the pandemic. I like framing. I think that's a positive aspect.
Right.
So you touched a little bit about cattle earlier, but I thought we'd close out our chat with you talking specifically about your research, which is about the history of the cattle trade in Quebec, I believe. So I thought if you could just tell us about this dissertation research and maybe how you got into it.
Sure. Well, for my MA, I was studying basically public space and human-horse relations in Montreal.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, going through my sources, like I kind of fell onto like the presence of other animals in the city also. And some of these animals were cows and cattle. And it just struck me how the relationship that humans in the past, but also humans today have with horses in general is a lot closer. And it's so different than with cattle. And I guess I just kind of had this curiosity afterwards to kind of reflect on, well, what's different between these two animals that we consider them so differently and react to them so differently. And so, the horse is seen as kind of this animal for leisure and as a companion almost, while for cattle, it's, they'll talk about cattle in sources almost as if they're items. And not that they don't do it at all for horses, but I feel like it's a lot more prevalent when they're talking about cattle, because we consider them to be just basically walking meat, most of the time.
Yeah.
So that kind of made me very curious to find out more about this type of relationship. But then I realized also that during the late 19th century, the cattle trade was actually quite significant in Canada. And some of these cattle came from the United States or from out west, and they would end up, a lot of them, in Montreal or Quebec City, and then they would be kind of exported to Great Britain. So I was thinking, well, there has to be kind of an impact in these different harbors, in Montreal Harbor and Quebec Harbor, because to kind of accommodate this type of trade, you have to have like structures built, and you can't just, the animals aren't just chairs, you can't just move them around and not feed them and not give them water and not have pens available for them and vets there to care for them, especially if you want to make money afterwards from their trade. So I was kind of thinking, well, how do humans in the past kind of deal with this, and what's the impact in our environment, in urban environments, you know? So I guess I kind of, that's kind of my reflection process into kind of going to my PhD, and how, why I decided to study this topic. And yeah, so it came from this curiosity of wanting to understand how there was an impact on the environment, but also how it changed kind of the relationship different people have to cattle. And what I've been noticing is there's kind of a difference between how Canadians in general reacted to Canadian cattle versus American cattle, or, you know, how vets would talk about cattle and primary sources versus the people who were actually making money and profit off of that trade. So, yeah.
Awesome.
I don't know if that answers any question at all. I'm just kind of going through my thought process.
I actually, like, while you were speaking, was kind of like, I was kind of interested to see that I was seeing a correlation with my own research with parks and small tourism business owners, where I've written about the tension between stewardship and exploitation. And I was kind of seeing that in what you're talking as well, because these people are responsible for these animals' lives. They're responsible for their care, their well-being, to the point that they can then, you know, make money off of them by killing them. And it's such an interesting tension. And of course, you know, that's become even more with factory farming and stuff, that tension is even more ugly and brutal, and something that humanity as a whole really needs to grapple with.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that really ties in with your first and second question, actually, because I mean, like 3 or 4 years ago, I never would have thought that the type of research that I was doing would be so important to what's going on today. But I realized more and more that actually, you know, as historians, we can really grapple with topics that, you know, occurred in the past, but still have such a strong impact today. So it's one of the reasons why studying these kinds of things is so important. It's because we actually understand what happened, and kind of the dynamics and how they evolved and changed, and why we are at this point today. You know, so why did this pandemic occur? Well, many reasons, but maybe one of them is, you know, like I was saying, destruction of natural habitats and just more intense farming practices, and, you know, focusing more on global practices instead of more local. So yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, this chat was so fascinating, and I learned some things, and I love how, like, I speak to people about such different topics, and it always informs the way that I think about my research. So I want to thank you for just, you know, getting those wheels turning, and hopefully you'll have the same effect for people who watch the interview. If people want to read Catherine's work on our site, I think the easiest way is probably just to go to our homepage and then go to our search and hit search animal, and Catherine's work will come up pretty quickly there. Our search engine's pretty good for that. So I want to thank Catherine for joining me today. This is great. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, great. So take care, Catherine.
Take care. Bye.